start with let's start with connecting devices additions. So for additions we use by the same token, again, also, and then, besides, equally, furthermore, further, in addition to, indeed, or of course, next, in fact, moreover, to, what is more, finally, being said that. In order to compare, for comparison or comparing two lines, we say compared with, in comparison with, in the same way or in the same manner, similarly, likewise, again, also. For contrasting, besides, but, however, in contrast, instead, conversely, it may be the case that certainly, also, likewise, naturally, nevertheless, of course, on the contrary, on the other hand, regardless, like, different from, alternatively, still, whereas, while, yet, although, despite, it is true that, notwithstanding, but be that as it may. Enumeration. Firstly, secondly, finally, in the first place, to begin with, more important, on top of that, next, concessions. Although it is true that it may appear, regardless, by concession we mean though something seems correct, it might not be correct, such as in hindsight. It may appear, regardless, certainly, granted that, naturally, it is true that, I admit that, of course, it may be the case that, I'm sorry, concession means agreeing. Exemplification, as, for example, for instance, thus, to illustrate, such as, to show specifically, let us take the case of making inferences, if not, in case, otherwise, that implies, then, summarizing or conclusion. In all, in brief, to summarize, in summary, in short, in conclusion, therefore, in a nutshell, on the whole, on balance, to sum up, basically, ostensibly, conspicuously, prominently, times, in changing with time, after, afterwards, at first, at last, at the same time, while, thereafter, concurrently, soon as, before, finally, in the end, meanwhile, next, subsequently, at that time, since, then, later, somewhat earlier, shortly, over the next 2 days, as long as, last, when we are focusing on results. Accordingly, as a result, consequently, since, as a consequence of, caused, for that reason, hence, thus, contribute to, in consequence of, brought about, lead to, corroborates. Reformulation. In other words, rather, briefly, put simply, that is to say, to put it more basically, transition, incidentally, as for, to turn to, with reference to, with regards to, concerning, place or positions, above, beyond, in the back, nearby, elsewhere, opposite to, behind, adjacent, here, near, there, far, to the left, below, in front, there, closer to, further on, to the right, sound. Some other good cohesive devices. Admittedly, all things considered, as a general rule, as far as we know, astonishingly, broadly, by and large, characteristically, clearly, coincidentally, conveniently, curiously, disappointingly, equally, essentially, explicitly. Even so, eventually, fortunately, fundamentally, generally speaking, interestingly, ironically, in essence, in general, in particular, in practice, in reality, in retrospect, or in hindsight, which means that if I look back, I should have done things better. Or although if I look back and whatever seemed right then might not be right now. In theory, in view of this, well, we use in retrospect or in hindsight in a case when we could have done things better in the past or we should have been concerned in the past. Because in the past something seemed alright. In more interestingly, more seriously, more specifically, naturally, on balance, obviously, on reflection, overall, to all intents and purposes, paradoxically, potentially, predictably, presumably, primarily, probably, remarkably, seemingly, significantly, surprisingly, theoretically, typically, ultimately, understandably, undoubtedly, unfortunately, with hindsight. So, in hindsight, with hindsight, both works. And by on reflection, need to check out. As with previous booms and busts, much of the new, sober hindsight emerged from the rubble of the previous boom. So the previous boom in the previous generation had some problems. The new hindsight fixes it. Of course, wrong decisions may be made, although it is extraordinary how easy it is to exercise hindsight when considering this kind of question. The term is often seen as a historical convenience as it was first applied to many philosophers in hindsight long after they had died. Retrospectively, adverb, with effect from a date in the past, before a law, decision, etc. was approved. The revenue is still deciding if the changes will apply retrospectively. So, with effect from a date in the past, before a decision was approved, the revenue is still deciding if the changes will apply retrospectively. Okay. Some good English from some good literature. The early warning literature typically defines a crisis as the result of vulnerabilities and a trigger event. Some studies suggest that asset busts have larger repercussions on the wider economy if the preceding asset boom was credit financed. When fueled by credit boom, asset price bubbles increase financial crisis risks. Upon collapse, they tend to be followed by deeper recession and slower recoveries. Ever since the US subprime meltdown and the ensuing global credit crunch and economic recession, regulators have looked for alternatives that can minimize the probability and severity of such events. In this paper, authors predict short and long term crises stemming from systemic risks in financial institution channels using an early warning framework. The primary aim of the countercyclical capital buffer regime is to use a buffer of capital to achieve the broader macroprudential goal of protecting the banking sector from periods of excess aggregate credit growth that have often been associated with the build up of system-wide risk. A financial cycle, the swings of which supervisors would like to alleviate. Among the new capital rules, the counter-cyclical capital buffer is one of the most important macroprudential instrument aimed at managing the risks stemming from the credit cycle. It is aimed at strengthening the resilience of the European banking sector to potential shocks resulting from a period of excessive credit expansion and to reduce the amplitude of credit cycle. Models for signaling the time period of a build-up in systemic cyclical risks. Rapid credit expansion as a result of financial sector liberalization, deregulation, financial innovation, low real interest rates, and abundant foreign capital lead to the build-up of macroeconomic vulnerability that over the medium term time may trigger a banking risk. System-wide indicators, the increase in non-performing loans and the real growth rate of private credit as having the highest predictive power in signaling the release phase. Most of the time, boom gradually decelerates, but sometimes the boom ends in twin currency and banking crisis and is followed by a protracted credit crunch that outlives a short-lived recession. In this paper, we characterize empirically these common patterns and present a rationalization for them. Credit market imperfections that are prevalent in middle-income countries, and asymmetry of financing opportunities across non-tradable and tradable sectors. So it may end up exacerbating the inherent pro-cyclicality of risk-sensitive bank capital regulation. We also note that Basel II does not address pro-cyclicality in any other way. G20 agreed that it was important to address the issue of pro-cyclicality in financial markets, regulations, and supervisory systems. FSF had formed three work streams to study the forces that contribute to pro-cyclicality. Mitigating procyclicality, including a requirement for banks to build buffers of resources in good time that they can draw down when conditions deteriorate. The Basel Committee published for consulting the counter-cyclical capital buffer proposal. In an international panel and shows that US boom-bust pattern is a regulatory of financial crisis. Theoretical models describe crisis as the result of a shock or trigger that affects a fragile financial sector. Theory shows how the shock is amplified with the extent of amplification driven by the fragility of the financial sector. Our results affirm the findings of others that financial crises do result in deeper and more protracted recession. A key empirical finding of our study is that financial crisis recessions tend to go hand in hand with a sharp slowdown in credit growth and investment, which are amplified if the leverage build-up during the preceding expansion was large. Against this background, in particular, we also examine the volatility spillover index computed for the period of to achieve this. So cohesive devices. To achieve this, the empirical estimates suggest, but then, however, overall, future regulations to account for this phenomena. We study daily stock returns, so this is basically for analysis section. We focus on predicting severe recessions. We draw on a new panel of database. Reinhardt and Rogoff have cataloged in panel data. On the policy side, a primary challenge going forward is to redesign a process involving central banks and financial authorities. So on the policy side, a primary challenge is a process, which is something that is a process involving central banks and financial authorities. In line with this search, projection methods pioneered in Georgia to track the effects of excess leverage on the path of 9 key macroeconomic variables for up to 6 years after the beginning of the recession. We can by and large confirm these estimates, yet we can advance them. Yet we can advance the analysis further and take a more granular approach than previous studies. The people on the front lines tend to look at things at a granular level, where the people in the front office tend to look at things at a more conceptual level. Without a bridge between these two types of thinking, strategy implementation is destined to fail. So opposite granular is conceptual, representing the perceived increase in risk during the turbulent period. Given the controversy surrounding the role of short selling, it would appear to be fertile ground for academic research. Provided some insights to this issue, it was not until the onset of the 2008 crisis that work began in earnest. This heightened research interest was a natural consequence of the increased public debate on the issue. However, other factors also played a part. For example, short sale bans imposed during 2008 crisis provided an ideal natural experiment for such research. Provided an ideal natural experiment for this research. The more recent research into the effects of short selling has provided some interesting insights. A number of other papers have provided a multi-country perspective. The attitude of regulators to short selling reflects both sides of the debate. On the one hand, regulators often publicly espouse the merits of short selling. Regulators often resort to either outright bans on short selling or impose trading restrictions during times of market turmoil in an effort to stem the falling market and reduce volatility. On the other hand, the purpose of this paper is to provide insights into the impact of short selling. Any reliable conclusion must allow for the fact that the bans themselves were introduced in response to the heightened volatility. Unlike previous work in this area, this paper uniquely focuses on the impact of the short selling bans. The estimation results indicate that impact of shocks emanating from countries which impose short selling bans is reduced during the ban period, particularly on other markets. These results are particularly interesting given the comments. Our results provide direct empirical support. Two foreign variables are included, exogenous variables. Daily equity market data is sourced from data stream for 26 countries. These countries fall into two groups. Table 1 provides details of the periods for which the later set of countries imposed bans. The crisis start date is chosen to correspond with the first ECB actions. A central issue in the current context is the observation that the main return during the period of short sale ban period is lower. Explaining a heat map, remember this is talking about sign spillovers. Light and colors indicate a positive transmission, Darker colors indicate a negative transmission. It is critical to differentiate negative in shocks from positive out shocks in the figures. The results suppose arguments that the blah blah blah. The HD model picks up at that point, but picks up much more substantially at a date closer to the stress associated with something. The DH index, however, shows some reduction in the effect of the spillovers, but a resurgence of positive effects around a period of uncertainty surrounding the future of Greece. Resurgence of positive effects. Financial institutions, in fact, prior to a particular period, financial institutions were in fact behaving in a way which reduced leverage spread. Only when the GFC became well established did the contribution of the institutions peak. When receiving shocks, each of the left-hand panels of the figure shows that the shocks received amplified volatility during the crisis period, although the confidence bands did not indicate significance in all cases. Figure 5 presents the HDS indice for the financial institution and the sovereigns separately extracted from the combined network. It is immediately apparent that the spillover effects from the two sources have dramatically different time path. Only when the GFC became well established did the contribution of financial institutions peak. And even then, the greatest contributions were observed in 2009 rather than around the time of the collapse. Subsequent, the error bands show when the Greek crisis, the diagram widens substantially when the Greek crisis, subsequent IMF programs, and European debt problems unfolded. During this period, spillovers in the CDS markets from sovereigns has been unerringly positive. The main result from these figures that the largest spreaders of shocks on the top right on other spreaders have a substantially smaller impact on the rest of the system. As recipients, with the exception of the financial institutions category, all the other types spread shocks more than they received them. And through to 2020, it is very apparent that each category of institution had a different role, but rapidly became amplifiers and have largely remained that way. Insurers had a dampening effect during some period, the period prior to the largest disruptions in European market. Figure 7 represents geographical influence of receiving and spreading of shocks are on average amplifying or dampening spreaders to each recipients. The impact of transmission from other markets was statistically amplifying. The transmissions originating in the US had been dampening CDS spreads since mid 2005. The first evidence of amplifying shocks occur. A brief intermission of neutral to dampening shocks precedes a further period of amplification in 2010-11 associated with the debt crisis. The asymmetry in the outcomes for spillovers indices between countries which do and do not implement bans is also evident in the following panels. The crisis period, while short sale bans have not been implemented, in all, we find consistent dampening effects for the transmission of shocks from dash, which impose short sale bans. The figures depict the portfolio size needed, and the figures strongly indicate this situation is related to increased volatility associated with the burgeoning European debt crisis, visible first in Greece. The pronounced rise in correlation of the stocks in the bear market associated with the crisis originating in the US. The tail correlations rose more than the US based crisis period. Oil price shocks make a notable contribution to the shock price for Malaysia and Indonesia. The contribution of oil price shocks to stock prices is relatively low. In June and July, the markets became aware that the big financial institutions were not insulated. They are not insulated from the debacle in the mortgage-backed securities crisis. After 7 months of learning about the problems in MBS markets and the ensuing liquidity crisis, next came the months of reckoning, with the consequences as nearly all US banks started to announce huge losses. As the MBS markets continued their descent in early 2008, Bear Stearns' financial position became untenable. Then came the most significant event in the unfolding of the crisis. After months of gyrations in the US financial system, the volatility connectedness started to subside toward the end of the first quarter of 2009. Coming back to the four troubled investment banks, it was true that they had high, viewed as the most vulnerable investment bank after BS Stearns, Lehman Brothers, net directional connectedness, blah blah blah. Putting the 2006 episode aside, one can discern three major cycles in the total connectedness plot. Once the initial tremors of the subprime crisis led the way to the liquidity crisis in the summer of 2007. In the meantime, as the financial statements of the major US firms announced, everyone, including the Federal Reserve, had become more and more aware of the serious trouble facing the US and the European financial institutions. The second major cycle resulted from the inaction. The heated political debate of the US fiscal policy flared up again. The so-called fiscal cliff unnerved the markets. We proceed in four steps, which invoke normality. Okay. Moving along this route with an eye to practical applications, such graphs are used to explore blah blah blah. The use of SOMs to monitor financial and economic variables has had a rise in interest in recent years. Being a very recent research strand, the number of contributions is actually quite limited. In addition, our paper resides in the literature on systemic risk. Moreover, leading to a global representation of financial market situation, the technique could be of aid to policymakers in order to realize more efficient interventions in periods of higher instability. This, in my view, is a key issue, as the intertwined nature of the financial markets has not only been indicated as an explanation for the spread of risk throughout the system, but also motivated in some countries. Financial stability mapping, the paper uses a method for mapping the state of financial stability and visualizing the sources of systemic risk, as well as for predicting systemic financial crisis. In addition, the method performs better than or equally well as a logit model in classifying in simple data and predicting out of sample global financial crisis. The SOM has not, to our knowledge, been earlier applied to monitoring systemic risk or assessing the global dimensions of financial stability, including global microfinancial proxies as well as individual advanced and blah blah blah. That is, a crisis in one position on the map indicates propagation of financial distress to adjacent locations. The sum is a projection and clustering tool that uses an unsupervised learning method like multidimensional scaling by performing from the Transmission of financial contagion is often defined by other type of neighborhood measures. Equity market co-movement. Notably, the movement of the financial stability states of the emerging markets are also similar to those in advanced economies, illustrating the globe dimension of the current crisis, while the emerging market cycle moves around that of the advanced economies. It does not indicate significant differences in the timeline or strength of financial crisis. Conclusions. Cyclos revision style. Similarly, indeed, even before erupted over weather, more generally is apparent, therefore, significance of the study. It would seem natural then to explore the links not only recognizes but one where joint roles played. This is the principal aim of the study. Not aware of any extant study, considers nexus between together with an attempt to our questions. We investigate the transmission, juxtaposing China first, second, third, hence. The paper is structured as features that in principle can potentially complicate. Among these, of course, is the level of, to name but three such characteristics. In addition, there is, until recently, some effort was devoted. The bottom line is, turning to the conduct of monetary policy, while most have argued, earlier conclude, indeed, pegged rate followed, more recently by, of course, macroeconomic, including the Eurozone, together with have arguably narrowed the gap. Data related considerations also loom large in any studies. Too difficult to contend to difficulties to contend with here. First, second, suffice to say that vast literature casts a negative view on. However, in spite of counting doubts, the latest verdict about the usefulness, finally, he concludes, turning to the case, the crisis led to emasculation of the federal funds. Some herald as signaling as an era of stagnation, low for foreseeable future, but stunt the recovery. This should actually encourage, as opposed to deterring greater cooperation. Simulations that adhere to a model of the new Keynesian variety. The model is, however, tailored, yet the international dimension in the form of volatile capital flows, to give one example, represents one such factor. Typically, the relevant literature seeks to, nevertheless, as far as we are aware, this is the case whether or not, it must also confront the view, to be sure. Moreover, in light of macroeconomic events that have transpired, it is far from clear if China, or for that matter, any emerging country. In the meantime, this may in part stem from, Shen points out, methodology. The estimation approach begins by, also motivated by, first, next, then, assuming, figure, together with the series that make up the benchmark, figure 2 plots additional. This paper has, secondly, accordingly, the latter in particular is found to, cyclos over 2. This paper argues, our study blends, we then provide the extent to which they represent a network, fiscal needs of nascent states to finance, also the role of, in so doing, the dual requirement of policy geared towards, this is nowhere more evident than in recent years, to quantify the similarities and idiosyncrasies. Additional counterfactuals also considered. Overall, also in spite of This kind of strategy does not bode well with, as is the case with, the same is true of a combination combined with B began to intervene. Of course, recent successes in where this view to change, it is difficult again based on the historical experience to see how central banks can stand in the way of eventually accommodating the fiscal stance the politicians want. This significantly changed the mandate of central banks. However, with the sent-off, this helped cement. However, this strategy needed to be balanced within the limitations of the tasks set out. The latter is indeed paralleling this development to the extent there exists dissent reflected in. At this juncture of policies, what has come to dominate the foregoing sentiments were also given credence by bankers. Nothing recently changes the consensus, the result to multiplicity. One of the great appeals of flexible inflation beyond this question is what remains unclear is the form in which this may take place. Complicating matters is that these channels now is a propitious time to examine whether one asks whether countries that did not. Convenience dictates that exchange rate regimes should. Clearly, how the all told, it is fair to say that the world economy, counterfactuals, while useful, cannot entirely replace. Third paper. Presumed to be done well by X as opposed to by Y. Accordingly, essentially, in lights of these findings, is X robust with respect to Y? Y provides an interesting setting for research on Y. It may therefore be possible. This has long been recognized in areas of research. Most recently, the unique institutional setting of this approach is common in extant literature. In consequence, it seems that results are in line with. Further, we find strong evidence that given the close intertwining between markets, this topic has taken on greater urgency since the bankers, for the most part, insist that instead, at the same time, therefore, it is plausible. Accordingly, the to preview the results, crucially in what follows, we focus. Typically, announcements unaccompanied by policy actions can also fail. Other studies in this vein include the latter focuses on turning briefly to the burgeoning literature. The work also stresses that the sample increases, including sample near the peak of the last tightening cycle of years, and ends the precise starting point, however, is dictated by availability across, whereas early research we include the content of bank information. This may reflect the possibility. Expectations can also, however, be influenced by factors. Moreover, as observers can and do parse central bank statements differently, parse means compute or interpret in ways that are unobserved, the measure we use is arguably more objective. Crack in the ice is called a crevasse. Further, the stream passes through the crevasse, the crack runs through, creeps up, runs along, typically induced triggers covering open up, dislodging, the bedrock becomes riddled with opening, the void exceeds certain limits, a significant collapse into the void. Wet climate causes the fastest dissolution of limestone bedrock. Active sinkholes can be relatively small, a few feet, or they can measure many tens of feet, depending upon how big the underground void was and how much material flowed into it. Anything of importance above the collapse can be drawn into it. A bridge in the embankment of a river or canal. Further, the stream passes through a crevasse in the trap rock and has a sheer wall of 70 feet. Inside a magnetized body, V is the force that would be exerted on a unit pulley placed in a narrow crevasse cut in the body. Magnetism on the walls is generally very different from that of H. Alright, that's all done. Thank you.